Hey guys, Pedro here to tell you about the latest from Ihsahn, self-titled Ihsahn, out February 16th on Spinefarm Records. The album has 11 tracks, 49 minutes in length, and this is his 8th solo studio record. He is a Norwegian metal artist. Now, before we get into this review, I think it's important to mention that the album is being released in two different versions, orchestral and metal, both extremely cinematic, because this album is very cinematic in nature, in the process, in the sound, in the experience, in the story that it offers. A record that from a design standpoint has a sense of beginning, middle, and end. It offers a sense of purpose, extremely well designed, with key songs creating the right moments that define the overall arching experience of this record. And I'm talking about songs like the intro of the album, obviously the outro, those two really connecting themselves with one another, allowing you to give you a sense of going full circle. Or even if you look at a movie, for example, how many movies start off with a simple instrumental piece as the movie starts, and then they finish off with the same or a similar instrumental piece as the credits roll. This record has that sort of experience, and then in between there's also some interludes that help connect the tracks, that help guide you and make the overall experience as fluid as possible. A really interesting design for a very interesting record. And if you ask me, do I start with the orchestral metal? Like, which version of this record do I listen to? Well, first of all, you listen to both. I think it's really important in order to grasp what this album is all about, to grasp the idea of the artist, you have to listen to both versions, especially because you can get a lot more out of the record for doing so. Now, which one do you go with first? Me personally, I felt like the orchestral one should be your starting point. It's the starting point of the project, is the starting point of the record. So you build up from there, because it's really a build up. When you start off with your orchestral version of this album, you're able to see the bare bones, you're able to see the roots, where everything starts, where the dynamics are created. And then you move into the metal version of the record, and there's a build up from there that allows you to better digest that second experience, that allows you to better appreciate it and see better the forest from the trees. If you go with the metal version first, I think it's much harder to move in reverse, because that's the experience that you'll get. You feel like you're going back in time and reliving something that you kind of lived already. Not quite, but somewhat. So in order to make things more fluid, more dynamic, easier to process, easier to digest, going orchestral first, moving to metal, I think it makes a lot more sense, and it gives a better sense of sequence to the overall experience of both versions of this record. Now, as far as the sound is concerned on this album, both versions have its own characteristics, as you could expect. That's why there's two. But there's the common denominator in both of them, and that is the orchestral side of the record and the keyboards and how much they're used on this album. These two are present in both. It's the bare bones, it's the spinal cord of this whole project, of this whole album. So you're obviously going to see them in both, and they're extremely impactful. I said earlier that this is a very cinematic experience, and you're going to see that in the orchestral, and you're going to see that in the keyboards. I was surprised, not necessarily from an orchestration standpoint, but I was surprised in terms of how impactful those keyboards are, not just in the melodies, not just in the sound, but the overall atmosphere and how it makes you feel different, using the same element, making you feel different about the songs, making you feel different about the experience, creating different atmospheres, different textures, making the album really come alive with every single track, with every passing moment, with every passing second. It's an album that just has great characteristics from that standpoint, and it uses those two elements perhaps as we've never seen before under these set of circumstances. The progressive side of the album comes across super clear, not just from a guitar standpoint, but also from these orchestrations and keyboards and how they interact with the rest of the elements, with the rest of the sound on the album, specifically on the metal version, obviously. Now, the guitars on this record, on the metal side, still have a deep impact, because a lot of the black metal influences that this album has, a lot of the darkness that this album holds, and this is a very dark album, a lot darker than I was expecting coming in, considering how cinematic it is, how much impact you have from keys and orchestrations. I was expecting that to lighten up the mood a little bit. But this is almost like a suspense thriller. So there is a sense of darkness built into those elements, but also from the guitars and the impact that they have, bringing in some black metal elements into the forefront. They're also very progressive in nature, in texture, in execution, and that allows the tracks to have different movement within the same song, allowing you to feel like the guitars are almost like a puppet master pulling all the strings that are attached to the orchestrations and keyboards. It's a really intrinsic album in terms of how it's built and how all the pieces interact with one another and are tied up with one another, and the movement of one is caused by the movement of the one that came before. Really interesting from that standpoint, but it was also interesting to me to see, even in the metal version, for the guitars not to be the main driving force, not to be the main ingredient of everything that you're getting, everything that you're listening to. So that was a surprise, as much of a surprise as the impact of the keys throughout the entire record in both versions. Now, the bass sound on this record, it's very impactful as well, and that was a surprise as well, because I was expecting it to be a little bit more drowned out by by the guitars and definitely by the orchestrations. But it actually came across really well and had an impact in terms of giving a little bit more substance to the drum sound, but also giving a little bit more emphasis on those darker portions of the tracks and those darker portions of the record. So I really enjoyed the bass, the texture that it had, and the subtle impact that it offered. Vocally, it's an album that paints a painful picture, if you will. It's a really interesting delivery, and it's more dynamic at times than I was expecting. The way it moves, it's just really caught me off guard. I was expecting to get clean vocals, and I was expecting those clean vocals to bounce off more of the harsher side of his vocal range. It was actually not the case. I mean, the clean vocals are there, but I don't think they're there to bounce off of the harsh vocals. They're there to create a sense of separation between the two in terms of the story they're telling and the impact of that same story within the dynamic of the cinematic backdrop of the soundtrack that was created. So they work differently than I was expecting coming in. And then even within the harsher side of the vocal range, there is changes. There is a sense of sometimes going a little bit lower, a little bit deeper, not from a production standpoint as far as hiding the vocals in the mix, but rather in terms of the delivery, a little bit more subtle, a little bit warmer, a little bit lower, a little bit calmer, or bringing it a little bit higher up and pushing those harsher vocals a little bit more into the forefront, being a little bit more resourceful in terms of how you're using, having a much deeper and noticeable impact. So that was really interesting to see as well, because it allowed to create a lot of ebbs and flows. It allowed to create a lot of dynamics within the overall vocal performance of this record. Because if you're going to build an album that has this sound, that has this essence, that has this arching vibe, atmosphere, idea, concept, you're going to have to do something vocally to bring all of that to life, or at least to be the glue that brings it all together. And I felt like this album definitely achieved that. And it's a very interesting record, not just because it has two different versions, but in terms of what it offers and how it was created. I'm going to go as far as to say that this is his most ambitious record, solo record to date. Not just because of having, like I said, those two different versions, but just in terms of how complex this album is, and having two versions allows you to simplify as a listener a little bit of that complexity that the album offers, making the record overall a little bit more approachable, a little bit easier to digest, but taking nothing away from how textured, how big this album is, and how many moving pieces he was able to coordinate and make sense of it all. So it's a really it's a massive album. It's a massive undertaking to create a record like this, and then to break it down into two versions, allowing the listeners to really dissect it differently from two different standpoints. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with Promethean Spark. This is a very dark and progressive song. This is the second track on the record, but it's technically the first song because the track before this is more of an intro. So this is really where the album gets started, or at least this is where the album opens its doors. You're moving past the intro into the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the album. This is a track that has great substance. It has great sound, great atmosphere, and of all the tracks on this album, this is perhaps the one that has more of a familiar sound to it. It's the one that connects better with previous records, previous solo albums. So it's nice to have a song like this at the beginning because it gives you a sense of comfort. It eases you into an experience that's going to be at times perhaps a little bit uncomfortable because it's going to be very different from your expectations coming in probably were. So having a song that gives you what this album is all about, because it's a song that has great orchestrations, that has a cinematic vibe, that mixes in clean vocals, harsh vocals, that has great sound, that has that guitar influence in terms of the black metal influences, that has prog elements as well. So it's a song that really represents the album well, but at the same time, the way it's offered, the sound, the presence, the way it's put together, it offers you a sense of comparison with previous tracks. So it's a great bridge as far as the album goes because it bridges previous records with this record. Next we have A Taste of Ambrosia. This is a very somber, melancholic track. Now it drags itself with a melodic veil across the floor. That's kind of how it feels. The guitar sound is excellent on this track, and the orchestrations give the song incredible presence and incredible volume. It's a theatrical piece, and it's purest of essences. That's what you're listening to, and this is what you're hearing, not just from a musical standpoint, but from a vocal standpoint as well. It has its own climax built into the song, and it has outstanding moments of suspense in it. It's almost slightly Hitchcocking as far as the track is concerned in terms of the atmosphere that it creates, how it builds it, how it delivers, and how it impacts the listener. Last but definitely not least, Blood Trades to Love. This song, it's one of the songs that I thought was better delivered and better achieved from a vocal standpoint. Not that the other ones are not, but this one offered me something slightly different. It offered me a more sinister dynamic, specifically when the vocals go a little bit lower than what I had heard up until this point. This creates, within that harsher side of the vocal range, a more sinister delivery, a more sinister experience, almost like moving deeper and deeper into the shadows. You get that. And then when you have the clean vocals coming through, you have a sense of brightness, you have a sense of exteriorization, you have a sense of purity almost coming through, a little bit of good, of purity, of everything that you associate with that coming through. But when those harsh vocals come in and they move deeper, then that purity becomes not so pure anymore. The song becomes darker, becomes more somber, becomes more sinister. There's a sense of evil creeping in. So vocally, this track really offers that yin and yang between white and black, between darkness and light, and I thought that was really interesting because very well achieved. It was really well put together, and the sound behind it, it's there purely as a soundtrack to really set up this vocal conversation that exists throughout the track. This is it, Ihsahn with his self-titled Ihsahn out February 16th on Spine Farm Records. Let me know your thoughts on his work, on his material. Hit me up in the comment section, and I'll see you all at the next video. Take care.